May we then have Jackie, Pam and Kay, please.
Please state your full name.
Kay Durrant.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
My name is Jacqueline Wilson.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Please state your full name
Pamela Allen.
and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you. Thank you.
So can we start by each of you giving an introduction to your professional background and explaining the skills that you brought to the intermediary role? Pam, do you want to start us?
Yes, I'm happy to start, thank you. A qualified social worker since 1979, which clearly put me in a position of dealing with people who've experienced trauma via their own abusive situations or their experiences, together with lots of experience of people with bereavement and loss in various aspects of their life. I also worked for the courts during that time preparing reports in a formal setting.
Kay, do you want to go next?
I'm a former senior detective, having served for 25 years in the police service and done lots of work around trauma in the public protection arena, in particular around family liaison officer roles in the homicide investigations. I then latterly, in 2012, commenced training as a psychotherapist, and I'm involved in private practice, and again that has enhanced my knowledge with regards to dealing with those with trauma.
And Jackie, do you want to?
Yes, I'm also a social worker. I've been qualified for 38 years, and like Pam, I've worked across a number of sectors in the family courts, in local authorities, but also in hospitals as well, in paediatrics. And I'm also just coming to the end of 4 years of training as a therapeutic counsellor as well.
So before you talk about the substance of the report and what you were told by those you spoke to, can we just establish your method of working? Can I start with you, Kay? Approximately how many visits were carried out between the three of you?
We visited between 50 and 60 homes or places to meet with individuals and family members. And the age range was meeting people between the ages of 30 and up to the age of around 80.
And the chair in his introduction said that you'd spoken to around about 85 people, is that right?
Yes.
And Jackie, can I ask you, when did you carry out these interviews and over what time period?
Over around a 12-week period last year, largely between the end of January and the beginning of April 2019.
And what was the geographical spread of those that you spoke to?
We saw people in England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland.
At page 3 of your report, you say this about the range of experience of those that you interviewed. 6 had been infected with HIV, 50 had been infected with hepatitis C, 11 had haemophilia, 3 had thalassemia, 9 were infected through routine surgery, 12 were infected through emergency surgery, 8 were infected in connection with childbirth, and 1 person had been infected by their partner. Does that summarise that range of experience? Jackie, can I ask you then about the interviews themselves? Where was it that you saw people?
We saw people mainly in their own homes. We gave people the choice of where they would like to be seen. Most people chose to be seen in their own homes. Some people, for reasons of confidentiality, didn't want to be seen at home because of other family members being aware of our visit. And so sometimes we saw people in conference centres, booked rooms, etc. Some people actually wanted to be seen quite some way away from their own hometown as well. So we saw a small number of people in those circumstances as well.
And did you go on the visits alone? Did you divide them up between you?
We did. We largely went alone, except that Kay and Pam did the Northern Ireland visits together.
And how long would a visit take on average?
There was a range of visits. We weren't time limited at all. Our remit was we're here to listen to whatever people wanted to say to us. None of the visits were less than 2 hours, and some of our longer ones were over 5 hours. So we think probably an average of 3.5 hours.
And Pam, can I ask you then about the report writing in terms of what was the communication that you had with those you interviewed after the visit? What kind of communication did you have with them?
I suppose it start up to say that all our interviews were very emotionally charged and could be quite traumatic in some circumstances, because this was often the first time that the people we were interviewing had told their story. We established the groundwork there that we would produce a report, which would be a joint report, which was confidential, and we would also agree on which elements of that report people were then happy that were included in this report that we produced for the inquiry. So the methods that we used, we invited people to tell us their story. It was their time to tell us their story and walk through their story. We took detailed notes at that point. We then went away, developed the report, which we sent to our person. They added, subtracted, changed, got to a point where we were both comfortable. So they were jointly authored reports to the point that we put both our names at the bottom of the reports. So it's an agreed report of our conversation, which, as I say, then parts of that are included in our collective report.
So the agreement was the note of the interview was confidential,
Yes.
And then parts of that interview made its way into the final report.
Absolutely. And the reason people had decided they wanted to discuss with an intermediary is that they felt they wanted to stay away from a legal framework, to ensure their confidentiality was primary, and that the people who saw their individual reports were actually a very, very small set of people, i.e. ourselves and people involved in the blood inquiry.
So the reasons people used the intermediary service, if I can put it like that, then were for reasons of confidentiality, to keep their identity private.
Absolutely. And that of their families, obviously, which is still around stigma and the fear of that stigma, and also confidence. I think they felt that having an interview in their own homes generally, as Jackie explained, kept it, if you like, much more informal, and an ability to have some control over that setting.
So not having to write a formal statement was something that was attractive to some of the people you interviewed.
Absolutely, yes.
So you have that you've provided a report with which all three of you have signed. Did you all contributed to that writing of that report? Did you?
Yes.
The report is divided into themes, and you've grouped under each theme some of the experiences of those that you interviewed. I'm going to take you through those themes and ask you questions about what you were told. But clearly, in the time that we've got available, we're not going to be able to cover the experiences of all of the 80 people that you spoke to. But am I right in understanding that you've taken into account everything that you've been told in your report writing and in your preparation for giving evidence today?
Yes.
So can we start then by you set out both at the beginning and the end of your report that you were all humbled by the experience of speaking to these 85 or so people. Is there anything you would like to say about the impact on you of having undertaken this exercise?
I mean, just to expand on that a little bit, I think all of us felt completely humbled and privileged that families were telling us some of the most painful experiences in their lives. And whilst we are professionals, you can't not, on a personal level, feel sad yourself. But obviously our professional hats were really important, but it was also really important to show that kind of level of impact of hearing that. And families were telling us some of the most traumatic times of their life, and some of that, many of the families, it still continues with infections today, and those that have lost loved ones. And what was definitely needed was that ethic of care in terms of how we obtain that information. And I think we all agree it's one of the most significant things in our professional careers that we've contributed to. And we're honoured to do that and want to do the best that we can today to represent all our families.
Is there anything anyone wants to add to that?
I think we were really struck by people's dignity, the dignity that people showed, and their strength in managing these situations over years and decades in some instances. And we felt that, as Kay said, it was a privilege. We felt that we saw the best of humanity.
I think what I'd add to that is, and we've stated in our report, that the people we met all said, we're the lucky ones because we're still here. And that, to hear that from people who've experienced such trauma and such massive difficulty in their lives, automatically humbled us. Most of the interviews had tears, and that was the tears of those people we were interviewing, and our own. It was a very consolidating experience having interviewed these people. We made an attachment within those hours that we spent with them, which is probably quite different to other things that we've done in our careers.
Okay, so moving on through the themes of the report then. The first theme that you pick up is infection and diagnosis with HIV. And Pam, you spoke to two young men who'd been told they were infected with HIV when they were in their teens. Do you want to tell us about what they told you?
Yeah, these were two young men with haemophilia, young men at the time of the diagnosis, now in their 50s, mid-50s. Very struck by the first man who told me that he was a child when he was given the news. He was about 16 or 17, and I say about because he doesn't know exactly when he was told, but he was at college, and he was at college and would regularly be called down to see the consultant, and this was in close proximity, the hospital and the college he was at. And he had a phone call that morning to say, can he go down to see his consultant, go down to the hospital, which he did without talking to his parents or anyone else in his family. he went down to see his consultant to be told that he was HIV positive and that the incubation period was probably 5 years. He'd had that for 3 years, so he possibly had 2 years to live. He was clearly shocked. He had no support. He was told then that he mustn't have sex with anyone or to exchange any bodily fluids. What he did tell me, which had a massive impact and certainly I'll never forget, the consultant said to him, but tears don't count. They wouldn't create an infection. He wouldn't be able to pass on the infection with his tears. He returned to college. He didn't tell anyone. He went home. He still didn't tell his parents till a few days later. To this day, no one outside his family in the medical profession have heard his story. No one understands his HIV now and hepatitis C status. Certainly a story I will never forget. The next young man was 19. He, similarly, haemophiliac, was told he was HIV positive and had been for 3 years. Again, the incubation period, and he too thought that he'd got approximately 2 years to live. He described being in a state of denial and just taking himself off. He couldn't actually remember where he'd lived for a few years after that. He'd wondered and not been part of his family, got odd jobs, and it took him a good few years to actually come to terms with what had been said and to seek out treatment. He again is in his 50s now.
Okay, you spoke to a family who were given diagnosis by letter. Can you tell us what you were told by them?
Yeah, both this case and another case that I'm going to talk about were two families where I met the parents of children who had HIV. The first one was a young boy who was 11 years old, and the devastating news was not delivered in person, but a letter that they received one day, and just went to the front door and opened this letter, and in this letter it said, your 11-year-old son has HIV. Desperate for more information, the parents contacted the hospital. This young man was haemophiliac, and they had specialist professionals that they dealt with. And the consultant was on holiday for another 2 weeks. And this time for them was just horrendous in terms of getting that in the manner that they'd had that information delivered, and then having to wait for a further 2 weeks to have any conversation with a consultant. And this family later found out that the son had been infected some years earlier, this was backed up by medical notes. But in particular, there was a big thing for them because they were hearing at the time that if you could survive HIV for more than 2 years, then you were likely to live longer. And for desperate parents, that they were really trying to get information, and that was very difficult for them. The second family was a couple's, again, young son who was wrongly diagnosed with haemophilia, and later in years he was found to not be haemophilia. He was 3 years old, and later in his life, when he was about 7, they found out that he was HIV positive. And again, it took his parents 2 months to get the results. And again, that pain and agony of waiting, and then obviously receiving the news at the end that their son had HIV. The commonality, again, between the two families is when their children were informed that they were HIV, which for both families were around the age of 13 or 14, where they'd started to form relationships, and both of the young boys were getting girlfriends, and the parents had to then share the information with their sons, and responses such as, am I going to die, and having to deal with that with a teenager were extremely traumatic for both families. And to this day, Both of those boys are still alive, living with HIV, and one of the parents says every time a telephone rings, that's my life in terms of, am I going to find out that he's died? And it's just that constant fear of their child dying, even though we're a number of years ahead, is still as powerful today as it was then.
Jackie, can I ask you then to start us off on the next theme in your report, which is infection and diagnosis with hepatitis C?
We saw a large group of people in respect of this issue, and we've been able to find three key themes that we want to speak about today. The first one was when people presented with symptoms, there was a reluctance and a significant delay in professionals acknowledging that these might be as a result of hepatitis C, so a lack of investigation and an explaining away really of symptoms, particularly when people presented with the very significant fatigue that goes with it. So people were describing, they were said it was because of their stage in life. So if they had young children, women who just had babies, if they had demanding work roles, etc., there was almost a default mechanism of kind of explaining it away, and sometimes that went on for years into more than a decade, and people spoke about all that time the disease was silently progressing within them, and obviously they had concerns about infecting others, and we'll come on to speak about that later. The second theme was about some real insensitivity in the way that people were informed about their hepatitis C status. And then the third area was once the hepatitis C was recognised and confirmed, a real reluctance to acknowledge that it might have come from infected blood or blood products. So, for example, one chap who had a transfusion as a result of an injury late in his life, in his 60s, and then developed the hepatitis C. He'd been in the army during the war, and the doctor asked him if he'd been a drug user or shared needles in the army in the 1940s, and he was horrified by this. It felt a real slur on him. Lots of people described being told they must have caught it abroad. One woman told me that her late husband was told by his specialist that he was imagining the symptoms, and when she accessed his records after he died, the record said, "This is a miserable man, always complaining." And this man had cirrhosis by the time he was diagnosed. One woman was told by a doctor who didn't examine her physically and didn't do any test that she had ME rather than hepatitis C. Very few people were given detailed information about hepatitis C, we found, when they were first diagnosed. And many people described having to do that research for themselves, particularly if they had any specialist issues. And some of their GPs actually acknowledged that and saw them as experts by experience and were grateful for the help that they were given. But it was very unsettling for people to think that their clinicians didn't have the level of experience that they wanted them to have. Lots of people described themselves being asked about their lifestyle, particularly in relation to alcohol use. Many were asked whether they'd used drugs and whether they'd had contact with sex workers, which was terribly demeaning for them. In terms of how people were told, one man told me he had haemophilia, and he went to his regular haemophilia clinic with his wife and two small children, and was told in the room without any warning that he had hepatitis C and that he had 3 years to live. And he had his children on his knee. A 3-year-old and his wife had a 1-year-old baby. Another man who was 23 at the time, he had thalassemia. He was told by his consultant that he'd tested positive for hepatitis C, and this conversation took place in a corridor in the hospital. He'd not been asked whether he'd consented to the testing being carried out, and there was no discussion about treatment. As with Pam's description, the only advice he was given was that he shouldn't have unprotected sex. And again, this was discussed in the corridor. There was no other description at that time of the implications of hepatitis C. Pam's got some more examples.
Yes, I met a lady who was infected at the point that she had needed to have an emergency caesarean. Child was at 25 weeks and the placenta was ruptured. Her husband had made the decision about needing the caesarean, and following that, obviously, she needed blood. She was hemorrhaging. And this was the point that she became infected. She didn't know that for 20 years and 20 years on. But the point of this here is twofold, that talking about how she became infected clearly brings to the fore the trauma of losing her baby, losing her child, and that she didn't give consent to any of the treatment at that time. Her husband clearly felt that he needed to make that decision because her life and the life of the baby were both hanging at that point, and he needed to make a decision. So the trauma of having to talk about how she became infected and the loss of a child is clearly something which is unimaginable. Moving on from that, this lady then experienced some of what Jackie's just referred to for years, the fogginess, the depression, the weight loss, the fatigue, and didn't know until another 20 years on that she actually had hepatitis C, and how that had been contracted. She also, we're going to talk about it later on in the report, was a blood donor because she was grateful that she'd actually been given blood, which had kept her alive. She went on to be a blood donor, and we'll talk about that later on, and the impact there of the guilt of that instance as well. And the late diagnosis that I met, like Jackie and Kay, a number of women who all experienced these symptoms of fatigue, poor memory, severe aches and pains, confusion, and saw GPs over many years who talked about their busy lives and that there were women who were working, sometimes had children, and weren't dealing with the stress of their lives very well. And it was often into 20, 30 years before they were diagnosed. So during that period of time, their confidence, their lack of self-esteem, their feeling of vulnerability had been layered upon layered during that period of pre-diagnosis. And I think Kay's got more examples there too.
I just wanted to continue the theme around the late diagnosis of hepatitis C. One of the families, I met a lady who was infected with hepatitis C and her 2 daughters. Sadly, the lady passed away last year, so isn't here to obviously hear this evidence being given today. I think it's really important that I reflect something she said that day as well to me. But one of the issues for her was that her family had requested the medical records and found out that she'd been diagnosed 13 years previously, and it was actually in the notes. And the GP had taken the decision not to inform her or the family of the diagnosis based on the patient's mental health. This lady did have depression, which is no shame at all. And she had capacity, and she had that choice taken from her for 13 years. And she felt very, very strongly that this wasn't a decision for a professional to take away from her. That should have been hers. And she said to me, I should have been told because I could have infected my family. And the impact that had on her psychologically, finding that out 13 years later, I can't describe, you know, how she reflected that day. She was a lady then in her 80s, and it had had such a profound impact on her life, knowing that these 13 years she could have been responsible for hurting somebody else. And her actual daughter said to me, you know, it's disgusting and it makes me angry that they didn't tell her. It was irresponsible and put my mum, the family and the health professionals at risks. Just to touch on two other cases as well, that family cases that I heard of, was where families had pre-existing conditions and yet didn't find out until 2004 and 2009. And yet they've been having all these blood tests taken for years and years and years, and found out, one of the ladies found out because she was progressing through to IVF procedures, and found out in a private process that she had hepatitis C, not through any other procedures. And likewise for the other gentleman as well, he had a pre-existing condition that meant he regularly had to have blood tests, but again didn't find out until 2004. And they have real questions around, you know, even if it was in the early 90s where hepatitis C was, you know, there was a test available, why did it take so long for us to find out? And the implications of us having that for so many years was so important for us to know. And they're both very angry about that. Yeah.
I met with the family of one infected woman who, when she was eventually diagnosed, after a diagnosis, she went to an appointment with a consultant hepatologist, and the way that the progress of the illness was described to her, she was given a flow diagram which had been produced by the British Liver Trust, and she'd kept it, and I saw that it looked to be part of a PowerPoint presentation that had been prepared for professionals, and the diagram showed the progression of hepatitis C and its implications, and it showed a life expectancy of 30 years. There was an arrow that went across with diagnosis and then 30 years and death being at the end of it, and it showed the progression from potential infection to cirrhosis and liver cancer to the end stage. And at this point, it was 26 years since the woman had been infected, and she said that she was left to make the calculation herself. She said, I had to do the maths, which was that she'd got less than 4 years to live, and she did unfortunately pass away within that period.
Jackie, I think
Yes.
you also spoke to a number of people who were angry that there hadn't been a recall programme that could have identified them earlier.
Yes.
Do you want to speak about that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, we will speak about that later. Are you going to talk about
Yes,
that now?
I'll give my couple of examples here. The first person I visited was a woman who had blood transfusions in 1973, but only been diagnosed with hepatitis C three years previously. And she started to tell me her symptoms and what life had been like during those intervening years by way of her health. And it was the first time I'd heard this and took my notes, and she was a very, very brave lady because she was very unsure about contributing to the inquiry. I'd had telephone conversations with her before I met her, and indeed, once she started talking, it was like the floodgates had opened. She, as I say, gave me a perfect account of the physical symptoms and the emotional symptoms and how her life had changed. The next lady I saw, I knew what she was going to say. When she started to talk to me about her symptoms, I knew what was coming. And throughout my interviews, I certainly understood that these women who'd all experienced these same symptoms didn't know about each other, and they saw that HIV and hepatitis C was something that was generally about people who'd led a different type of life or who indeed had illnesses such as haemophilia. They did not understand that there were women out there with hepatitis C in similar circumstances. And that in itself, I started to say to these women, there are other women with your experiences, and that brought some comfort. The second lady I saw, who'd had blood transfusions in 1985, the way that she found out about her hepatitis was, again, very traumatic. She'd spent, as I say, 30 years, this lady, experiencing these dreadful symptoms, were very debilitating for her. Then she had what she saw as routine blood tests as she was entering menopause, possibly, went to the hospital for her results, and the consultant's line of inquiry entirely confused her, asked if she was or had been a sex worker, asked if she'd ever taken any intravenous drugs or snorted, and she said she didn't even understand what snorted meant. Then asked her if she'd been involved in alcohol, whether her partner had been involved with sex workers. She asked if he could look at his notes to check that he was seeing the right person, had he got the right name. She was so confused about the line of questioning and highly distressed at the line of questioning. At some point then, she was trying to think about what possibly could have happened. It was actually the same hospital that she was getting these results, where she'd had a blood transfusion some 30 years since with an ectopic pregnancy. And it was only at that point that the consultant was able to change their approach to her. She'd gone on this visit for her results alone because she expected a result of a standard blood test, so was entirely and deeply traumatised. Throughout this period, when she had felt very vulnerable and weak because her health had been so poor, at least having an explanation about why her health had been so poor and her emotional well-being had been so poor, at least explained to her that it wasn't about her difficulties, but actually was a physical illness. But the way that this was delivered was clearly something that she could never recover from.
The lady that I spoke about earlier, who'd seen the PowerPoint slide, she was a woman who left a written testimony of her experience of the infection. And in this she wrote, and I want to quote this, she said, "I feel that my country knew they were sourcing blood, where they were sourcing blood from, and when they had the opportunity to correct this terrible disaster by completing a recall programme, they failed to carry it through. This was proposed in 1985. If I had been traced and tested in 1985, then the virus would have been more treatable, maybe even clearable, and today I would not be left with the cirrhosis of the liver, which could lead to liver cancer. I'm left with a possible death sentence. It's destroyed all of my plans for the future, and I've lost my ability to dream." And this lady did, unfortunately, pass away relatively soon after that.
And that anger at there being no recall programme, is that something you heard from other people that you spoke to?
It was a really strong issue.
Before we move on to the next theme, is there anything anyone wants to say about infection and diagnosis of hepatitis C?
No.
So the next theme that you pick up, and you've already referenced this, is infection of blood donors. Kay, do you want to start us off on that theme?
Yeah, several people were concerned that they'd been blood donors and that they'd actually passed on the infection without their knowledge. And we've kind of discussed this and put this under this theme of good people doing good things. You know, one gentleman that I met was 17 years old and had been involved in a road traffic collision. and as a consequence of that has had life-saving treatment in the hospital, and was so grateful that that had been done, that he went on, like others, to be blood donors. 15 years later, he was waiting for his next appointment to go and donate blood, which he did every year, and the service contacted him to say that wasn't possible, and he had to wait a couple of weeks to find out why, and the why was because he had hepatitis C. He was absolutely devastated. This was a man who had already, once he'd got diagnosed, struggled significantly in terms of his relationship with his children because he was so scared of infecting them. And then at the same time, his mind was around the guilt. And, it's very easy to say, well, it's not his to have. He felt guilt. He still feels guilty that other people throughout that 15-year period would have been infected. And he was doing a good thing, having had his life saved. And I think it brings up the issue that we talk about later on, which is in the absence of any psychological services, specialist psychological services with people who can get the support to work through that and feeling guilty, and to kind of work through that's not something that they have to bear. He today lives with that tremendous guilt, and it continues to impact on all his relationships in the here and now, and he still has hepatitis C. So yeah, that's
A couple of examples from me. We met a woman who'd had blood transfusion when she was 14, and she started to be a blood donor when her age permitted. And she then discovered in her 30s that she had hepatitis C. This lady was pretty tremendous in so many ways. She now worked in a factory with, actually a depot, with lots of men. In fact, she was the only woman working in the depot. And very, very keen to keep her cups separate and all her individual items separate because of her fear of cross-infection. But the blood donor van, as we call it, comes round, the mobile van, to the factory to take blood donor. And all the men go out to give blood, and she can't and doesn't. They don't know why she can't and doesn't, and they call her names like Scary Cat, etc., because she won't give blood. Clearly, she can't share with them why she can't give blood. And the listening to her account, because she was such a good woman who'd given blood for years, but then, as Kay is explaining, felt so guilty about the number of people she may have infected during that time. Another example was a woman who'd had an ectopic pregnancy, and she had a very rare blood group, so was encouraged and obviously wanted to give blood, which she did, and she continued to do that for 20 years. And during that time had possibly infected people and lived with the guilt of that also.
Jackie, can you start us off then on the next theme, which is other infections?
Would this perhaps be a convenient moment, do you think, Miss Scott, to take a coffee break?
Yes.
The evidence will take a while, so if we break at a natural point, that's what we'll do. And we'll take a break now for half an hour. But can I just say something before we separate? Well, I'll go on talking anyway. I don't think what I'm saying needs to be recorded in the same way. It's not evidence. It's just I wanted to say that I know a number of you may not have been to the inquiry before. Can I repeat what I've said on previous occasions? It's natural when you're at an event like this, perhaps to want to take photographs or to use your mobile phone. What you've heard this morning has been about people who can hardly bring themselves even to talk about what has happened for all sorts of reasons, but in particular because they want their identities to remain entirely anonymous. The same will be true, I'm sure, of quite a number of people who are here. So please don't take any photographs in or around the inquiry unless you are sure that the person you're photographing or people you're photographing are happy with that and that you're not catching anybody else unwittingly in the background. The press won't. Please don't. Respect other people's desire to be in control of who knows about what happened to them. I'll see you again at 12 o'clock. Yes.
So we were, Jackie, I was asking you just before we broke to move on to the next theme, which was other infections.
Yes, we saw a small number of people who, around about 10 to 12 years ago in their memory, were advised that they might have been exposed to variant CJD through their treatment. And whilst they felt some reassurance that this was being properly investigated, the manner in which they had been informed of that was really quite brutal. And they all spoke about receiving a letter completely out of the blue. That wasn't, there was no phone call, there was nothing via their GP. And the letter said in a very formal manner, we understand you have received blood or blood products from someone who has been diagnosed with variant CJD. Would you like a test? And they, for some of them, this was the period when they were not only managing the symptoms of the disease, but they were in that period where they were having interferon, ribavirin treatment as well. And it was just the last straw for some of them. One of them said, you know, what else? What else is going to be thrown at me in that respect? So that was a relatively small number of people, but a big impact for them at that time.
Okay, can I ask you then to move on to the next theme you pick up in the report, which is consent?
Okay, so very few people could recall being asked for consent about the use of blood products or a blood transfusion, and nobody recalled any of the risks of transfusion being discussed with them by professionals at the time. And it was just accepted with those who had haemophilia and thalassemia that they would receive these products. And almost like this is a wonder drug, and there was this kind of, you know, we're really grateful for this, but none of those risks and the issues around consent and any discussions were recalled, or very few were recalled. Particularly, I wanted to make reference to a lady that I met who'd been informed by her consultant that she'd sought out herself a second opinion because the treatment that she was being given in another hospital was interferon only because she had genotype 1 hepatitis C. And as a consequence of that, she was being given the treatment and she was really struggling with the side effects. And it was getting to the stage in terms of that it was impacting on every part of her life and her family's life. And she wanted to come off this, or at least know some more information. And she felt real pressure from the first professional to continue. And this went on for quite a long time until she eventually said, no, enough's enough. And she saw a second opinion. She went to a completely different hospital and had a very different experience. But what she also learned from the second consultant was you were on a trial, and she had no idea that she'd been on a trial. She'd had no discussion about it. She'd not consented to it. And this is in contrast to another gentleman that I met in a different area of the country who also had genotype 1 hepatitis C, who'd had a really long conversation about interferon-only treatment and its success. And actually, he'd made a decision because it was so low at the time in terms of, you know, what could happen. He'd not, and he waited later until 2015 until the new drugs became available, and that's when he made a different decision. But it brings out this real issue of consent around risk and consent around trials. And I was going to hand over to Jackie then to talk about another issue relating to consent.
Okay. When lots of people who had transfusions in an emergency said obviously that they weren't in a position themselves to consider the implications, but none of them, it wasn't explained to them about the possible risks of having transfusions. One person's parents were telephoned in the middle of the night to give consent. The person was 16 and she'd had a hemorrhage after an operation. But they were asked to give consent verbally, and they were told it was in the context of life-saving procedure. And they and other people reflected on the guilt that brought for them, that they had consented for their child to have that transfusion. And lots of people said to us there was this terrible irony of having their life saved on the one hand, but being given something which would ultimately limit their life on the other hand, and that was very difficult to deal with. There was a specific issue that someone explained to me, and this was a person who, in a relatively new relationship, was informed by her partner that he had HIV infection, and it was agreed that she would go to his consultant to have some tests, which she did, but she was also tested for hepatitis C. She didn't know that the partner had hepatitis C, and so she wasn't asked for consent or told that she was being tested for hepatitis C. And when she took this up later with the consultant, she was told that she couldn't be told that she was being tested because it would have compromised the confidentiality of the other person. And she felt really strongly that her rights, her welfare had been overridden by the confidentiality of someone else. So the next section is we want to talk about people living with the infection, and we're very much minded that this audience can tell us a lot more than we could ever explain to you. I'm going to speak to the accounts that were given to us about impact on individuals of that. People talked about the impact of hepatitis C, particularly in vivid detail, and the really common issues were chronic debilitating fatigue and how that impacted on their lives. Often lasting for years, as we've said earlier, without diagnosis. Other symptoms were severe aches, gastrointestinal problems, skin changes and sweating. These are physical issues. Cognitive impairment was often described as brain fog to us. And that led to a debilitating level of confusion and inability to focus that was sometimes combined with associated anxiety and depression. And quite a few people spoke to us about losing their way on the way home, not being able to remember journeys. Lots of people were really anxious about driving, for example, because of the impact of that upon them. People have also experienced mental health problems to a significant effect, which really impacted on everyday life, their relationships as well. People described the later stages of the disease, this again physical issues, where the liver and organs were affected, living with the worry about varices and the possibility of those bursting. They're obviously enlarged veins. people having to go through really painful and invasive tests, particularly in the early days when liver biopsies were very invasive and involved, without going into too much detail, long needles and breaking through the skin. One witness said to me, as a result of my infection and the worry around it, I've suffered mental strain and stress to the point of thoughts of suicide out of my fear of having a nasty death. So it wasn't just about where people are at the moment or were at the moment in the course of their disease, but that kind of anticipation about where this would lead to. And the point we would want to make was, even though we've seen the majority of people we've seen have now been cleared of the illness, lots of them are still experiencing some of the symptoms of the illness itself, the impact of those, and of the treatment, which we will come to speak about later as well.
I want to briefly touch upon the impact on family and other relationships. And there's a number of strands to this element. The strand of the pressure in a family of keeping a secret because of the stigma, if the outside world was to realise what was happening by way of the infections. But also the actual daily routines in families which were creating lots of stress. The need, or the perceived need, to keep separate towels, to keep separate crockery, to make sure that there was no bodily fluids exchange between the infected person in the family, often the adult and the children of that family. So the different elements that were happening there, together within some families, you've got more than one infected person, particularly with families where there's haemophilia and we've got brothers, sons, fathers, etc. So you've got a number of layers of different tensions and pressures for those families. And the impact on keeping the secret, and meeting a number of people who actually didn't want to have discussions within the family because they didn't want to burden the rest of the family with what they felt was their condition. So to have your children having to understand that condition they felt was burdensome, so kept a lot of that to themselves, which created stress, anxiety and often depression in the way that Jackie's relayed it. So we'd got families who were certainly had a feeling of secrecy and an underlying almost depression, but certainly an anxiety within the families, which was palpable often. And I think Kay was going to talk to us about a specific case that she'd been in contact with.
One of the families who I met had a child who had been infected with HIV, and I think probably to explain the impact on family and relationships, the best way is to use her words. And what she says is, we have nothing else to compare this to. Our child was infected and it took the joy out of our lives. Psychologically, we became different people. We cut off from others, and the depression we carry has at times almost torn us apart. In my darkest days, I even chose the music for our son's funeral. And although this couple feel extremely lucky that their son is still alive, what we talked about was the impact this has had on them as a couple and within their family relationships outside of that, and with their other son. And one of the things that we commonly found was that we would sit in maybe the front room of somebody, we'd be talking to two people, and they'd be sharing their thoughts, feelings, and exactly what had been going on for a number of years. And one part of the family member would say to the other, I never knew you felt like that. I never knew that had gone on for you. And that was a common thing that came about this holding the feelings down, sometimes even in the most close relationships, because actually they were just surviving the moment, trying to put one foot in front of the other day by day. So yeah, so that's them, and I'll just hang back to
me.
Okay.
The business of keeping secrets was a real strain for people, we found, and a few people said to us they had to learn new techniques of when they were in company with people, and to be able to manage the kinds of things that they talked about in case the conversation went down a particular route and they found themselves in saying something which they then had to extricate themselves from. So not at all expecting in their lives that they would have to do that. And one chap I spoke to said, I'd never lied to anybody in my whole life before, and that was a really hard experience about not being able to tell the truth to his workmates about his condition. And quite a few people said that they had other chronic conditions when they were asked about their symptoms as well. Going back to the issue about personal relationships, we did see a few people who sadly found that their closest personal relationships were affected. One man that I spoke to who'd lost his brother to HIV when he was 20 and his brother was 23 said, growing up he was my best friend. We were inseparable in the school holidays. But his HIV diagnosis drove a wedge in our relationship. It was something that we never discussed properly, and we were never close after that. And that's one of my biggest regrets, and I feel guilt to this day. We saw people who made the decision, as Pam's alluded to earlier, about just not taking the risk of having an intimate relationship, of starting a relationship with a partner. And I have to say, we met some lovely people who would have made wonderful partners, wonderful parents, and they had that choice. They felt that they had that choice taken away from them. And I think one man really summed that up for me. He said, it's hard to go on a date with a woman and tell her you've been infected, and that she and any children she had could have been infected too by having a relationship with me. And that was terribly, terribly sad for us to see that.
I think probably people in this room will all remember the medical advice in the 1980s for men co-infected with HIV and hepatitis C, which was to abstain from any sexual activity which involved exchange of bodily fluids. And at least 2 of the men interviewed remained celibate throughout their 20s after receiving this advice. And I say at least because clearly this was a sensitive and difficult subject for any of us to be talking about with the people we interviewed. So it was quite difficult to actually get the extent and understanding of how this had affected people in all kind of parts of their relationships. So that the 2 men who talked about being celibate, one did marry later, but the other never felt able to have a relationship for fear of infecting a partner. Similarly, the advice on sexual activity was not clear for people infected with hepatitis C. And everyone who we interviewed described significant stress because of this. As we've said, even when they were in very close living relationships, it was still an area which was very difficult, and probably one of the most difficult areas for us to explore and understand entirely, other than we knew that the amount of stress that this certainly brought with it. We've met a number of couples who spoke with immense sadness about limiting their families because of hepatitis C. Obviously, on a number of occasions, it meant that until they'd had their infection cleared or noticed that infection was cleared, some were older, fertility had diminished in some cases. Others just felt they could not risk the infection returning if they had children. And emotionally being spent in the sense of even beginning to think about the responsibility of children. We spoke with a number of women who had terrible, terrible sadness as their lives had been about having children at the appropriate point, and that had now been something that was lost to them. So we certainly, I think those were some of the very, very sad interviews, that even though there'd been a recovery from hepatitis C, the future was limited in so many ways, with a terrible, terrible sadness.
Just wanted to follow that with looking at those that were the impact in communities. So one of the families that I met, and those with underlying conditions with thalassemia and haemophilia, developed friendships with others at some of the places that they were going to have their treatments and their transfusions. And one of the real impactful things was a gentleman who said to me, we were like a little family. We were in and out all the time, and it was hard seeing them die, and how that impacted on him and his life, and still does today. I just wanted to...
I spoke to one woman who, unbeknown to her, was infected during a transfusion after the birth of her first child, and then had some trouble conceiving later on when they wanted to extend their family, and she was referred for IVF, and obviously part of that service was that she had to have some blood tests, and she received a telephone call from the hospital which said, you are no longer suitable for IVF because you have hepatitis C. And that was how she then found out about that. She did then conceive naturally, and she said that there was real trauma then surrounding her second child's birth, which was highly, highly medicalised. When he was born, he had to have his stomach emptied via suction to ensure that no blood had been ingested. And she said the midwives took him to the other side of the room to do that, so she wasn't able to hold him for quite some time. Eventually they were both moved from the labour suite, and they placed her in a side room away from other patients, so that she couldn't mix with other mothers. And she said that was a highly traumatic period of the first hours and days with her second child, and that really impacted on her as a parent as she went forward.
Jackie, I'm going to ask you now to turn to the next theme you pick up in your report, which you've alluded to already quite a lot, and that's stigma and shame.
Mm-hmm. This was a huge issue for absolutely everybody that we saw, and you'll have heard that it's mapped through the other things that we've said. People lived with an enduring sense of feeling blamed and feeling shamed about the infection. Which was really compounded by the national mood. Lots of people said the whole thing was mixed up about the national mood in the 80s, in particular around HIV and AIDS, and the judgments that were placed on people in respect of that, and a sense of moral panic, really, that they felt very frightened about. More than a couple of people talked to us about being called junkies in the street, and in other wider friendships. Some people didn't tell their children at all about their condition, as Pam was saying earlier, and that was because they didn't want the children to be bullied at school. They were really afraid of that. I saw one woman who was really acutely anxious about anyone finding out that she was infected. And the receptionist at her child's school, at her GP surgery, was also a parent at her child's school. And she went through such agonies every day, wondering whether this receptionist might have shared inadvertently or in any other way information about her infection. And this led to a really crippling anxiety. So the family felt obliged to move house, and they moved 25 miles away. Away from all of their support networks. And then 4 years later, she had a new neighbour who was a GP at a local surgery. And again, this triggered her anxiety, and the family had to move again. And the issue there was that there were additional burdens for people about dealing with this situation, but having to move themselves away from the support networks which were helping them through it. Okay.
Just wanted to touch on the issue that we've mentioned there about society's response to the blood infection through the time, and specifically in relation to prejudice and discrimination. And one family I met talked about in the 80s having a sign in their local area displaying a sign that said no homosexuals or haemophiliacs. And what people were doing with that led to another gentleman who was haemophiliac having to have his own glass in his local pub because people knew that he had haemophilia, therefore he might have HIV. And society at that time and in the media, there was some high-profile kind of footage being released about HIV that was creating this fear and scaring community, and then that was leading to a real lot of prejudice and discrimination in society. So not only did we have these internal issues of managing family relationships, managing yourself, you've then got the societal impact of the prejudice that was out there, the fear that was out there, and how that was handled and managed at the time was adding to the psychological stress of our families.
Did you want to add anything?
Just bringing us to present day, really, that we know that people felt there was an ignorance around hepatitis C, but a need to share some of their status with others as a need to protect others. But what they were hoping was from the blood inquiry that there was much more of an understanding within our communities about infected blood and how it was caused, and that the publicity from the inquiry would raise awareness and help to quash these ill-informed myths that were around. So they brought us into present day as to what they hoped from the inquiry.
Pam, can I ask you then to pick up on the next theme in your report, which is an impact on education and work?
Yes, certainly. We've heard that we've met with a number of people with haemophilia, and we know that in the 70s and 80s, it certainly wasn't uncommon for children with haemophilia to be educated at what we knew as special schools, during that time, for pupils with additional health needs. And I interviewed two men educated in one of these schools who actually had very good memories of the schools at that time, and they were supported in managing their haemophilia and injecting themselves to avoid hospital. And they explained to me how prior to being able to inject themselves, there were frequent visits to hospital, and that clearly interfered with their education and their ability to actually spend time in and around other young people. So the introduction of the new clotting agents, new clotting products, gave them freedoms that they hadn't previously experienced. Obviously, in retrospect, they all commented on the catch-22 of the long-term implications of the resulting infections. So we had this mixed picture of, yes, we enjoyed being in these schools, and they gave us the freedom that we hadn't otherwise had. And there was a good understanding of their medical needs. But then, as I say, we have the implications of the clotting agents. I also met with two women with thalassemia who actually had very different school experiences. And that may have been due to the fact that there was a 15-year age difference between them. The older woman found that thalassemia led to fear and exclusion by other children. She required frequent blood transfusions and was absent from school for a significant amount of time. And she doesn't recall any additional support during those years. I actually interviewed this woman while she was having a blood transfusion. I sat with her in hospital during that time, and her whole life as being around, sitting in hospitals and having blood transfusions. She was a very, very bright woman with lots of energy, but her schooling had been entirely wiped out by her need for blood transfusions, and then later on an awful lot of treatment. The younger woman with thalassemia was well supported at school and college, and her experience at work, though, was not as positive. One of her employers required her to make up the hours missed for her transfusions, resulting in long days and further exhaustion, which we knew she experienced through the hepatitis C. Clearly, it wasn't sustainable to have to make up her time at work when she'd been to have treatment and blood transfusions. The days that just weren't long enough for her to do that. It felt an entirely unreasonable expectation of her. So she moved employers for those reasons. Fortunately, her current employer is much more supportive and flexible, and she's able to lead a more regular life with this level of support. But for the two of them, it was very, very restrictive.
Jackie, did you want to add anything about employment?
Yes, we saw quite a few examples of people who'd had to give up on their education. For example, I saw one family where a young woman had been to university and had to give it up after a year because her father was in the end stages of his illness, and she couldn't bear to be away. She said that every time she went back to university, she feared if she would see him again, and so she gave that up and wasn't able to pick up with her learning for several years after that. But we also saw people who gave up on education when they were infected, either because of the pressure of treatment at the time. I saw one man who was trying to take professional exams whilst he was having interferon and ribavirin treatment, and he said one day he just slept in for his exam because he was so exhausted, and there was no quarter given about that. He just had to miss out on his exam. People who were experiencing mental health difficulties and didn't feel able to continue with their studies. And a couple of young men who just said they thought it wasn't worth it because they thought their life expectancy was going to be so limited that they didn't want to invest their time in education. On the other hand, several people spoke to us about their absolute determination to keep on working in spite of their debilitating condition. And sometimes this was about wanting to contribute to society and not giving in, feeling that they didn't want to give in to the illness and allow it to take yet more away from them. But for others, it was a financial issue, and they just couldn't afford not to work, and so they had to carry on. And I saw a couple of people who said they felt they had to drag themselves to work in their 60s until such a time as they reached their statutory pension age, because they just couldn't afford not to do that. And they spoke about the impact of trying to work with carrying those symptoms of the illness, and people spoke about a life consisting of working and sleeping, really. For years, just trying to keep going, people having joint replacements, that kind of thing. Several people had to reduce their working hours or change careers, actually, because the nature of their work, or working for 5 days a week, was really just too much of them for them. And people then spoke about how there was a loss to society as well because of that. So some of the examples that we saw were about, a woman who was a nursery nurse who had to retire at 49, a nurse who had to retire at 52, a teacher who had to retire early because her mental health problems as a result of her son's condition were just too much for her to feel that she could carry on with that.
So I'm now going to move on to the next section, which is treatment, care and support. And can I ask you, Jackie, to start with some of the experiences you heard about the attitude of healthcare professionals to those that you spoke to.
Our view is that anybody who's experienced a serious illness or any illness knows the importance of the manner in which a person is treated. It is often as important as the treatment itself. And we heard a range of experiences from people, from sensitive and expert care, which they really appreciated, to brutally delivered information, inappropriate questions, and frankly poor quality care. Lots of people described their consultants as lovely. They shared examples of medical nursing staff absolutely going the extra mile to support patients with home visits, open door access. Some of the consultants attended the funerals of people who had died. One woman who was widowed when her husband died said that she didn't know how she would have survived without the support of the consultant. And in the course of the work that we did, we were able to trace where the consultant had got to in the country, which was nice for her because he'd moved on. Quite a few people spoke to us about, particularly those with haemophilia, who said that their own consultants felt a real anger about what had happened to them, and they were active campaigners around infected blood and really working hard to find new treatments to tackle hepatitis C in particular. One thing that we wanted to stress was almost exclusively people spoke very, very positively about the specialist nurses, the specialist hepatitis C nurses, who provided a flexible and practical response to the challenges they faced, and probably came the closest to any kind of therapeutic help for people in the nature, in the manner in which they conducted their work. One family described a really positive experience of care for their uncle who had haemophilia. And this was a man who'd been born in the 1920s, so he'd undertaken some extreme treatment in his youth when people were finding a way. And he was under the care of the same two consultants and a very dedicated nursing team throughout his life. And the family said the team were like a second family to them, and their lives revolved around visiting the unit. And when the family went back to the hospital as part of their work to support this inquiry, the receptionist remembered them from 30 years earlier, which was an indication of that real sense of family that people had. And they felt, in terms of their uncle, that they, given the extent of his haemophilia, they did an amazing job keeping him alive into his 60s, and actually died when he was 65 as a result of hepatitis C, unfortunately. And at that stage, he was the oldest haemophiliac in his home city. So they had some real mixed feelings about the clinicians had really worked hard over many years to keep him well and to keep his longevity, but it was such a shame that after all that excellent care that he passed away as a result of the infection. Pam's got some other examples.
Yeah. I met with a man who had a very positive account and experience of his treatment. He had developed Hodgkin's lymphoma in his late teens and had been treated for that very successfully and enjoyed good relationships with his consultants. But he was contacted by his consultant around 1995-96. The consultant was extremely apologetic that the infected blood had been given at the hospital where the consultant was working. And the man I was interviewing was extremely keen to emphasise that the specialist care received for his Hodgkin's lymphoma and hepatitis had been excellent. And as he visited his GP, he said he welcomes him like a VIP. He's always made to feel very special. And certainly his treatment, he said, couldn't be better. He, of course, was very aware that the blood transfusions which were there helping to keep him alive in the first instance, became a roller coaster of events that, following that heightened feeling that he was being treated successfully, then came the news about this hepatitis C and needing to continue to have different treatment. Fortunately, the day that I visited him, he just had the all clear from his hepatitis C treatment and was in a very good place. So we had a good outcome, and certainly we've been in contact around our presentation today, and he continues in good health. So as I say, a very positive experience, which is very heartening to hear. I think Kay's got an example too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Jackie had mentioned about specialist nurses and some of those doctors and nurses that had been there and were real positive experiences. In contrast to that, where specialist facilities were not available, people described being treated in clinics alongside drug and alcohol users or with cancer patients, and I think that was mentioned earlier on. If they lived in an area with low incidence of hepatitis C, this also limited their ability to establish networks and gain support from other people who were also affected. However, in contrast to that, in the families that we met, I met one specialist social worker who is working with the haemophiliac community in that area, and it is a designated post, a specialist social worker, in relation to everything in and around psychological support, financial support, general advice. And to use their words, they said, we'd not be where we are without her today. She's helped us deal with financial and emotional matters. We rely on her, and everyone deserves this support. And where services didn't have that, others spoke of feeling isolated and abandoned. And that specialist service made so much difference for a family who were going through bankruptcy because their business had to fold. And actually, through the specialist knowledge out there, they were signposted and got some help and support and managed to keep their home. And obviously, their children live with them there as well. So it made such a difference. And that is a service that is out there in one of the areas that we came across.
Stark contrast to my last example. I have a pretty harrowing example from another family. And one man recounted that his father had leukemia and received stem cell treatment followed by blood transfusions. He was at this point infected with hepatitis B, which was noted as the primary cause of death on the death certificate. And I think all three of us have seen a number of death certificates throughout this, our time working in the inquiry. His father had been told by the consultant that an error had been made and the wrong blood taken out of the wrong fridge. This had affected 8 people, 7 of whom had died. The father was told he may be all right, but in fact he died 3 months later. Again, that sounds like a pretty strange story, but they were able to show me a statement that father had given to his solicitor at the point that he was informed about this, and they'd still got the statement, which didn't ever go anywhere in legal terms, but was there as a record of this meeting with his solicitor. Following on from that, the family were distraught about their father's treatment, as he spent his last weeks in an isolation ward at a psychiatric hospital. And this was a man who was a businessman. He'd fallen ill only a few months prior to this because he was having a successful treatment for leukemia, and then, as I say, became very ill very quickly. So to have his last days in a psychiatric hospital, an isolation ward, and this was due to the lack of provision to treat his hepatitis B in the main hospital and the fear from the hospital workers that he was highly infectious. And And father wrote this account when he was told about the infection, which, as I say, was formulated into his statement. And I'll read some of the words which were in this statement that they were able to show me. I was told today by the consultant that the blood cells were contaminated. It has not really sunk in what has happened. Now that I have hepatitis B, I cannot be cured, and there is a possibility that it will be passed on to others who come into contact with my blood. He died very shortly after this, and I'll come on later to talk about the circumstances under which the family heard about his death. Handing over to Jackie.
Just to pick up a couple of things from what Pam said about death certificates, I had two differing experiences. The young man that I mentioned earlier who died from HIV, it wasn't mentioned on his death certificate. His death certificate said that he died from liver failure, and the explanation to the family was that the medics had done them a favour by not mentioning the HIV in that respect. With another family that I worked with, their doctors were very angry that their patient who had haemophilia had been infected with hepatitis C, and they were determined to make sure that that was noted. And on the death certificate itself, the doctor had written diagonally right across it in large letters hepatitis C, and the woman who I worked with said that when the registrar opened it, she was quite taken aback. And the message was that the clinicians really wanted people to know the cause of that. In another example that I have, I saw a man who had successful treatment to clear his hepatitis C, and he and his family felt they wanted to move to a new city for a new start, and so his treatment for haemophilia transferred to a new hospital. And on his first appointment, the doctor that he saw said to him, "Oh, I see you've got hepatitis C." And the chap said it was a terrible shock to him, as he thought that the infection had cleared. And he was told to come back 6 months later for a follow-up appointment. And when he went back after 6 months, he was told that this was actually a clerical error, and what should have been written on his record was that he was positive for hepatitis C antibodies, had been wrongly copied as positive for hepatitis C. So he spent 6 more months thinking that it had concerned, and he said that really put him through months of hell. Another issue that came up for us around treatment, particularly in the earlier days, was essential tests and equipment weren't always available on the NHS for people, and people were expected to fund them privately if they wanted to have these newly developing facilities. And in 2005, one patient was told that a FibroScan would determine the progress of the disease, but there were no facilities in this country, and she had to travel to Paris in June of 2005 at the family's expense. The following year, a FibroScan machine was installed at a hospital 74 miles away from where she was, and she had to travel there for scans for 7 years before she could have them more locally. And then in June of 2008, a consultant advised that due to the level of cirrhosis, she needed to have an enhanced liver fibrosis test. Again, this was not available on the NHS, and she had to pay £99 to have this carried out by a private contractor in an NHS hospital. And just we wanted to share with you that the words that people most frequently use when discussing access to treatment were leper or pariah. That was how they were made to feel. And there were many, many experiences of people being denied treatment or isolated from other patients because of hepatitis C. And we saw quite a few people who had difficulties with dentists, for example, and Pam has an example there to share. Oh, sorry, it's
So,
K's.
yeah,
It's
no
K's.
worries.
I'm sorry.
Just moving on, we're talking about the dentistry. One of the families that I met had such poor treatment in relation to dentistry, where the procedure had to be undertaken in the hospital, the hazardous stickers were out, it was at the end of a day, the attitude of staff was not good for him at all, that it left such a significant impact on his life that for the rest of his life he's never gone. He's still alive today. He won't go to the dentist because the experience was so poor that this has led to, when he has needed a couple of extractions, he's done that himself. And actually, you know, if you think of that in context to the pain that you must have to go through in terms of extracting your own teeth, you would have to have suffered so much of a psychological impact to do that it's astounding. In contrast, there was an example of one woman's dental nurse commenting loudly in the infection, but the dentist was challenged, the nurse was challenged, should I say. So there was some good evidence within professional environments where people were not behaving in an okay manner, but there was also some evidence of other professionals challenging them, and that really making a difference for the individual in terms of that prejudice and that discrimination.
So I was going to, we've come to the end of that theme and going to move on to another one for treatment for hepatitis C, but I noticed the time.
So this would be a convenient moment to have our lunch break, would it?
Indeed.
Well, can I thank you very much so far, and I hope you don't mind having to come back after lunch. It'll be 2:00, but what you have so far told us, I think, has been really valuable and worthwhile listening to. So thank you so far, and I look forward to seeing you back at 2:00. 2:00. Yes, you're moving on to the next topic.
Yes. Pam, you were going to start us off on treatment for hepatitis C.
Yes, thank you. Take people right back to the beginning when we explained how many people we'd seen with various disorders and illnesses. And we actually met with 50 people who were infected with hepatitis C. And I think it's fair to say on behalf of all three of us that it was truly shocking to hear for the first time just the experience of these people who had been treated with interferon and ribavirin. They described it as grueling, similar to chemotherapy, which lasted months and in some cases years. A small number of these people had said they were given clear information to help them prepare for the impact of the treatment. And a good example here was a couple who were both being treated and able to plan that, so one had the treatment before the other, whereas others felt they entered it quite naively. And I think all three of us heard the phrase that we had heard from a number of people that said, this was the worst year of my life. People certainly articulated suicidal thoughts, and people seriously had contemplated taking their own lives because they could not see an end to how they felt. They described a very, very debilitating illness, extreme tiredness, staying in bed for days and days and days, not coming downstairs, literally for weeks, to be with their family. Hair loss, significant weight loss, and also profound impact, not surprisingly, on their own emotional and mental health. Many of the effects of the treatments have endured and have become lifelong conditions. I need to talk about a young woman with thalassemia who had been engaged to be married when she started the treatment. She was in her early 20s then. Until that point, she'd had a life where she'd been very successful. She'd managed her thalassemia well with a very, very supportive family. Then learning about her hepatitis C and starting with the treatment absolutely changed her life to the extent that she certainly suffers with a great deal of depression, anxiety, loss of confidence. And she talks about not leaving her parents' home for a year. Her wedding that had been planned had been cancelled or was cancelled. The relationship ended. She was unable to work or consider any career prospects. The anticipated future of leading a life with a partner and a child and a professional job that she had were all lost. Sadly, she's now got cirrhosis of the liver and is deeply pessimistic about her life expectancy. A very, very sad story. We heard similar stories time and time over. Hand over to Jackie to give further examples.
I met one lady who was diagnosed ultimately with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the impact of her treatment, which she described as traumatic. And that resulted in flashbacks and ultimately a very significant mental health breakdown. And the effects of the virus and the treatment have left her with enduring severe depression and anxiety. She describes becoming mentally exhausted very quickly and uses the word overwhelmed a lot in terms of how she feels. She described the overall result of the infection and treatment as an existence of survival and coping with little contribution or fulfilment. I met one family whose relative had an uncommon, we think, reaction from the treatment, which was a very significant weight gain and the implications of that. This lady had been an average weight, looked after herself very well, but throughout the course of the treatment, the weight gain meant she moved from a size 12 in clothes to a size 22. And the significance here was that this further led to her isolation. She felt very embarrassed. She didn't feel that she could go out shopping. Her son said to me that she felt that people judged her because of her weight. And her son said to me that he felt like holding up a billboard saying, "This is not her fault." And so she became, as I said, further isolated, didn't go out, again then impacting on low mood and anxiety as well. As Pam said earlier, lots of families hadn't been informed of the likely impact of the treatment. A few people said to us they'd been told it would be like flu-like symptoms, which, as I'm sure people here know, doesn't go anywhere near describing the impact of that kind of treatment. But particularly, people didn't realise that the mental health and mood changes were related to the treatment. And so they went through agonies in their families, in relationships, and self-blame and blame of each other. And some relationship breakdowns because they hadn't realised that this was not the real them. This was what the medication was doing to them. Kay, you had some.
Yeah, I was just going to talk and bring it forward to around 2015 and the people who have been able to use the new direct acting antiviral treatments. And many spoke positively about this. And everyone on this treatment programme that we've met has been cleared of hepatitis C. And very few had serious side effects. And obviously there was people were really glad that it took less time, and some people felt the benefits in a much quicker time frame, with one person feeling after a couple of weeks, I really think this has worked, and it had. With regards to people receiving the treatment, there was this kind of double-edged sword with we're the lucky ones because we're still alive and other people have died. And actually, in some situations, there were individuals that got the feeling from some of the professionals that they encountered, think yourself lucky that you're getting this. And, you know, those kind of feelings didn't leave them in a good place. And obviously those that hadn't had that experience were really appreciative of getting a really good service and obviously clearing the hepatitis C. One of the gentlemen that I met was really shocked that after I'd visited him early last year, he'd had the need to go to the GP and was really shocked. He's had this condition since the early 90s, that the GP was kind of telling him that he'd got hepatitis C. Well, he's known that for a long, long time. But what was more shocking was there wasn't a discussion around the new treatment. And to this day, this man still has hepatitis C, and there's a treatment available there. And that really does bring about the issue of ensuring that everybody is afforded the opportunity to go on the programme in terms of the new treatment. And, you know, that's something that was really quite shocking to hear.
Jackie, some of the people you spoke to discussed liver transplants with you. What were you told?
Yes, we saw 4 people who had liver transplants, and I wanted to just share 2 examples of different experiences, really. One man had a successful transplant which really transformed his and his family's life, and his wife said to me that it gave them 9 of their very best years together. Sadly, the hepatitis C couldn't be cleared, and his new liver became infected. But she was very grateful for those 9 years that they did have together. Another family I spoke to who were hopeful for a liver transplant. It was the lady I spoke to just recently who had the very significant weight gain. Her liver disease progressed to cirrhosis, and when she was assessed for a liver transplant, the assessing surgeons refused to undertake the procedure because of her weight. And the family were really angry. In their words, they said she was infected by the NHS. The NHS treatment caused her weight gain, and then it was that made her not qualify to have the transplant that she then needed, and she subsequently died.
Jackie, you spoke to a number of people about end-of-life care and end-of-life experiences. Can you tell us about that?
We found a range of experiences. Several people sadly talked about their loved ones experiencing very traumatic deaths, often related to multiple organ failure. Some of them were treated very appropriately and sensitively. Others had less pleasant experiences. One lady spoke to me about her mum not having a peaceful or pleasant passing. And a few people talked to us about the cruelty, how it seemed very cruel at the end of people having to have their fingers really squeezed hard, for example, to have their blood tested, etc. One lady described to me her mum who was dying from liver failure at the age of 51, and she was in the last days of her life. And the daughter was outside of the room, leaning up on the wall outside of the room, and one of the doctors came out and he tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Cheer up, it might never happen." And she just felt that it was so cruel for anyone to say that, as her mum was so close to her life. But in contrast, she then said there was another lovely doctor who sat with them one night and very gently explained that he didn't think her mum would reach the morning, and explained to them exactly what would happen over the coming hours. And this felt like a really respectful and compassionate discussion. And what she described was just that contrast within a 24-hour period of the 2 different approaches in that respect. I saw another lady whose husband had hepatitis C for a long time and was then unfortunately contracted hepatitis E through food poisoning, and so he became very ill very quickly. They had a very poor experience in hospital. No specialist beds were available, and he remained in A&E. Although she was very concerned about the decline in his condition, she said, in an echo of the original experience about hepatitis C, the nurses said he was just very tired, and he actually passed away during that period. And she tried to speak to the hospital afterwards. The family complained to the hospital about the quality of care that had been received, and it took a year for this complaint to be dealt with. And the hospital said that they'd done all they could do, and they couldn't find any learning from that. The family felt really strongly fobbed off. And this is similar to another example that we saw where a widow whose husband had died from hepatitis C went back to the hospital to ask if it had been caused by a blood transfusion which he'd had as a result of an injury. Obviously, they found out subsequently that it had. And she was asked to sit in front of a panel of 4 doctors. And this is a lady who'd just been widowed, and she was in her late 60s, early 70s. And she said, the daughter said that they all backed each other up. She was there on her own against this panel of 4 doctors, and she just felt intimidated and humiliated, really. And in both of those situations, both of those families said the family just did not have the energy to carry on with those complaints because of where they were in their bereavement and coping with the condition.
Which leads me on to my example, which is not dissimilar. I mentioned earlier about the man with leukemia who'd got hepatitis B from blood transfusion, who spent the last weeks of his life in a psychiatric ward because of the perceived need to nurse him in isolation. His wife visited the hospital needing to travel on 2 different bus routes. Took her certainly upwards of 2.5 hours either way. At the point that he was ending his life, his family weren't informed that his death was imminent. And the day that he died, his wife took her usual lengthy bus route, and she'd taken flowers to celebrate the fact that it was their wedding anniversary. And when she arrived at the hospital, she went to the ward and saw the empty bed. And that's how she'd been told that he'd died. She's still alive, and I met with her, a very stoic lady, and a bit similar to what Jackie has just mentioned, hadn't got the energy and the emotional energy to take this matter forward. So a truly tragic death for this man and his family. Okay, I think you
wanted to move on. We've touched on a number of people spoke about the impact of losing loved ones to early and traumatic deaths, and one of the families that I met had lost their child. This was a family whose teenager had had an accident, needed to have a blood transfusion, and very quickly after that transfusion she became very, very poorly, and after a few months she died, and she was 14. Losing anybody is difficult. Losing a child is something that people will say is forever life-changing as well in terms of that. And there was a sibling as well, and the impact on the sibling was significant. Her voice in this process, I would like to share with you. There is nothing worse than the loss of your child. It destroys your whole life. I had so much time off work, I was almost sacked. It changes your personality, and it's devastating. And you just function day to day, and there are no words to describe it. I just want to just say a little bit about this lady who, again, we described about all our families, was a lady. She's now 80 years old. The death was quite a significant number of years ago, and she's had to compartmentalise how she deals with that to be able to go on for her other child and obviously the family. But she felt so strongly for this inquiry that she had a voice. And Sir Brian, she was so grateful that the intermediary process was available for her to be able to honour her daughter's memory and be able to have a voice in this process. And I think that is a really, really important part of, you said earlier on, this was a new process. It was so important, in particular in that case, and I would say in all cases, that this option was available.
One of the things that we recognised, and something that people said to us was, those losses are tragic and traumatic for the individual families. But we recognise as well that those deaths were a loss to the wider community and to society itself, really. There were examples of the local undertaker, who was such a support to his local community, the much-loved school lunchtime supervisor, the nurse who died too early at age 51, all people who provide excellent services to their community and to society overall. One man spoke to us about the lost potential of his brother, who died at 23. And this young man was a talented musician and singer with excellent academic achievements. His brother said, "I know that, had he lived, he would have made a huge contribution somehow. He studied medicine at Oxford and then changed courses to study law and achieved a first-class degree. He was a polymath. His death at 23 meant the whole country missed out on what he could have contributed."
Kay, can I ask you then to move us on to the next topic, which is access to psychological support?
So I just wanted to start this area looking at kind of it historically. So looking at those that were infected in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there was quite a common theme with regards to there were very few examples of those that received or were offered psychological services. Some did, but may have had to seek that out themselves. So one of the other things that I encountered was some people I spoke to who would have found it really hard to ask for help and support, and the need for specialist psychological services can never be underestimated in terms of those people who need to have that time and that longer therapeutic period in their lives to be able to work through some of the issues that have been around for many, many years. And the whole issue nationally, I know, is being addressed around mental health and stigma. And I know there's lots of efforts nationally now, and some spoke of how positive that is. And we can open the doors for some of those people that need that service now, even if it was 30 or 40 years ago, as well as those more recent. Some spoke of, if it was a tailored psychological support for people, it's important for people to know the history of infected blood and blood products and the whole history of that. Others may have commented on, actually, those professionals can learn some of that away from the therapeutic environment, but actually it's important that they have some knowledge of it so they can actually work with clients and work with them and their experience of the environment. Yeah, I'll hand over.
So, Kay, can I just ask, were any of the people that you spoke to offered psychological support in the early days of the infections?
In the early days, for myself, that was No.
No. Is that the same for the both?
Almost
both of-
exclusively, yeah. I saw one lady who was asked to go to a group in respect of her condition, and when she got there, she was in a group of people who had addiction problems, and she felt that was highly inappropriate for her situation. And then another one where an infected person who was themselves a health professional was asked to lead a group, and again she felt that blurred the boundaries between herself as someone who was experiencing the issue. I did speak to one woman who had two different experiences. She was referred to an NHS psychologist who told her that she must have had a death wish because she'd had a relationship with somebody who was infected. But she then later sought help through the Hepatitis C Trust, who were incredibly helpful to her and supportive, and arranged for private counselling for her, which was excellent in taking her forward. So some very different experiences there.
I can end this section on two positives. The young woman I've talked about intermittently with thalassemia, she had received counselling intermittently over the years, in the first instance around the treatment around thalassemia and how that impacted on her life. But then, of course, as she became hepatitis C, she began to have a different type of bespoke therapy around her particular needs. And that has continued. The therapy or the counsellor has been flexible in the sense of being able to be responsive to what she's needed at that time, and she feels that has been a lifeline. My second example is quite different. A woman who'd had the treatment, she'd had interferon and ribavirin, had been through an horrendous time, was one of those people who talked about it being the worst year of her life and feeling suicidal. It wasn't successful. She then had the new treatment a number of years later. Her doctor, her GP, she describes as being fabulous, and had talked her through how she needed to exercise and said do 100 yards this week, do 200 yards next week, go round the lake, etc., to the point that she felt fit and healthy. And at that point, he and the surgery hosted a tea party for her and her family to go to the surgery and have this tea party. And she said, again, it was a lifeline that the GP and the surgery got her through those times. So we do have these exceptional experiences from some of the people that we saw.
For those people that you spoke to that hadn't had any psychological support or counselling, was that something they'd be interested in if it was available?
Yes.
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 Across the board?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I think that there may be some work to do around those that maybe say, oh, I don't, like I feel like I'm lucky I'm alive, and just some gentle work there to do around just how important they are and how much they deserve that. But I think in the main, the majority would say yes. But I know of one gentleman that I spoke to when the issue of the enhanced financial arrangements came around for the psychological impact, really struggled in even recognising his own depression. His wife saw it, as did another family I can think of with the couple, but they were struggling because they just felt so lucky they were alive that they weren't recognising their own depression and anxiety, and that had manifested itself in so many ways, in particular being housebound, that there'd just be some work to do, and they deserve that.
So the people you spoke to aren't being offered any psychological support?
No,
No.
Not then and not now.
Not then and not now.
And the key thing was that people just would have liked to have been offered, and then they could have exercised their judgment about whether to accept that. But for the great majority of the people we saw, they were never offered. It was never discussed.
Okay, can I ask you then to move us on to what I think is the last theme in your report, which is financial support?
Okay, so the majority of people that we heard from with regards to hepatitis C had been told by professionals about the Skipton Fund. Others found out through the press or through relatives, and some didn't know about it until it became a bigger part of the inquiry. So there was kind of a group of people, the majority, who did know, but there were others, and I even had one gentleman who found out because it was through reading somebody's story in a magazine, and then thought, oh, right, I can apply for this, and did, and obviously was awarded. People spoke positively about the current schemes, but all expressed anxiety that this support might be reduced as part of austerity measures, meaning that they can't rely on it for long-term financial plans, and there were some who felt that payments were inadequate for others across the different areas, different awards, and that they'd like some kind of agreement moving forward, that there's parity with that. One of the things we discussed was around financial support, but also financial impact. So many of the people that we spoke to had suffered financial impact because a partner had had to give up work to look after their husband. And I think that the lady I met said, I love my job, but I love my husband more. And that financially impacted on them, but she had to give up work because he was so poorly in terms of his mental health and his physical health. And it was common for issues such as not being able to get life insurance, mortgages, holiday insurance. Some people didn't apply for jobs because of the fear of being asked the questions around their medical health, and they didn't want to share that. And I had one particular professional that worked in the medical field that says, I've been ill all my life. I'm always having tests. My life revolved around work at a hospital as a professional nurse and being a patient. I love my work, but it affected my prospects. So I couldn't progress in my career, and it's what I really wanted to do. And that at the end of that section, there's also in the report mention of the family who lost the child not being able to afford the funeral and having to get a loan and borrow money to actually be able to bury their child.
I met a family who had to borrow money from friends, and this was because during the period that the husband was having interferon and ribavirin treatment, this took 2 years altogether because he had to keep having pauses to allow his immune system to recover, and they had no income for 18 months, and they used up their savings within 6 months. His wife worked part-time, and that meant that they weren't able to access any benefits. They didn't know about the Skipton Fund or anything like that. And the only help they got was a £10 reduction on their council tax during that time. So, as I said, they had to borrow from families, and they found out about the Skipton Fund in a happenstance way as well, and thankfully were able to repay their relatives for the money that they'd loaned to them during that period.
And just to finish off in this section, we had a situation for 2 particular families who'd lost their fathers through infected blood resulting in hepatitis B. And currently there is no financial support available for this condition. One of the dependents sadly had died, the other dependent is still alive and very much in need of financial support, having lost her husband, who I referred to earlier on as a self-employed businessman, and having lost all access to any type of benefits and payments. So that's an anomaly within the system still as well.
And the end of your report, you set out the hopes that those that you spoke to, that their hopes for the inquiry. I wonder whether you can just emphasise some of those key themes emerging from that.
To return to where we started off, and the fact that we felt very humbled and privileged to be part of interviewing these people and represent them at the inquiry. The majority of people we know describe themselves as the lucky ones because they'd survived. And we heard this at the beginning of so many of our interviews. In our interviews, the people that we met, they were stoic, they were resilient, but also sensitive to the situation of those who had died, very much so, and their bereaved families and people currently who were ill and receiving treatment. So their messages to the inquiry are messages that I think the inquiry has heard throughout its time, throughout the time that you've been hearing evidence from those infected and affected until this point. So I won't go through all of what our folks said because you've already heard them, so some of the messages are the same. But we know as experts by their experience, they're the experts, not we three, they're certainly the experts. And they gave a very powerful collective picture, revealing those clear common patterns and themes. And that the commonality, they would like to see a clear timeline of when infected products were first used and when this stopped, along with an understanding of how decisions were made along this timeline to continue using those products, how risks were considered, and whether this was assessed as a risk worth taking. They particularly want to know what people in authority knew about the risks of infected blood when making strategic and clinical treatment decisions to continue its use. They want the people responsible to be held to account and to explain whether their decisions were made in good faith on the basis of what was known or whether there were other drivers such as finance. Some were concerned about a cover-up and wanted to know if this had happened and who was responsible. They wanted the public to know more about their experience, to replace myths with facts, and thereby to reduce the stigma associated with infections. They want the public to know that they were infected through no fault of their own, and that was certainly a theme throughout. Many people said that they would like the financial support arrangements to be reviewed to make it less of a battle for people to get help. They would like certainty that the current support would not be withdrawn. Many suggested that the attempts of government organisations to reach people possibly infected with hepatitis C have been ineffective, and I think we were probably most surprised by that there was no reach-out programme for those people who had had blood transfusions or received blood during those critical years. They spoke about people carrying infections they do not yet know about and how the lack of a recall scheme following transfusions left them with a ticking time bomb for years and an irreversible progression in their disease. They would like to see a scheme in which everyone who received blood products or blood transfusions from the 1970s until screening was fully effective would be offered a blood test. We certainly know from our work with this group that the inquiry has given them confidence to speak out. And interestingly, those people who were very, very keen to remain anonymous at the beginning of this process, by the end, and they've had contact with us, say, I feel able now to speak out, and they feel able now to be identified, not suggesting that we identify those people today, but you can see, those of you that looked at our report, some people have identified their loved ones who've died because they feel able now to be identified as people who've had hepatitis B, C or HIV as a cause of death of their loved ones. So this process, and Kay's already touched upon it, has given them the strength and the self-esteem and the confidence, some of that confidence back to be able to talk about this more openly, and are very grateful for the inquiry, having heard their voice.
Is there anything else either of you two want to add before we finish?
We just want to say we are so grateful to the people who allowed us into their lives, really, and to pay testimony to them. This has been a tremendous experience for us professionally and personally, and we take our hats off to you folks.
Yeah,
We
I
do.
agree.
Ms. Scott, do you wish to check with those behind you whether anyone has any further questions?
Yes. I think that's a no, sir.
Well, I have one. It's been said to me in a number of statements that the author has lost trust in the doctors and the clinicians who have treated him, and therefore finds it difficult to accept or take medical treatment now. And I think one person has described it as the single greatest loss arising out of the infected blood events. What, if any, reflection did you have of that idea from those that you were speaking to?
I think, Sir Brian, it's around building that trust and confidence for people to be able to step into now, in particular the gentleman who's still not had treatment, step into an environment where some trust can be built to work towards eventually going and having some treatment. I found it absolutely heartbreaking that there's a treatment that somebody can have, but because of their experience, they won't have it. And that was further made worse by last year's experience for the same individual. So I think it's about building trust and confidence, and the psychological services is an opportunity to engage, but to really engage with individuals to say, what's the way that you would want to access some services? Because for some people it would be group, for some people it would be individual, one-to-one. But it is about reaching out rather than just people getting access to the psychological services because they've filled out the form and ticked the box that's in there. I think it's that two-way process of reaching out to those that we know about.
I saw a family whose son had had leukemia in his early childhood when he was 5, 6, and had a blood transfusion as a result of that, which resulted in hepatitis C infection, and then obviously all of the treatment thereafter. And he wasn't even able to see me. He had such a mistrust of anybody that he saw associated with authority or anything formal. And I had to see his parents, who very eloquently described his situation. But they said that his lack of trust extended into much broader avenues of his life, into relationships, personal relationships, as well as the more formal relationships with professionals.
Nothing to add from it.
Well, can I thank you collectively, Kay, Jackie, Pam, for what you have done for us. As I said before lunch, it's been very, very valuable indeed. But I want to thank you in particular for three things. And the first, and perhaps the most important, is for giving people a voice who would not otherwise have had one. And by goodness, you've given them not only a voice, but a powerful one. Thank you. And secondly, for the empathy which you have, each of you, in your own way, shown. I perhaps may be forgiven for thinking that on occasions there was just a quaver in your voice. And that comes despite having listened and prepared and rehearsed, but you're thinking obviously about the people that you have spoken to, and that is a tribute to you as well as to them. And thirdly, thank you for putting it in a structure which has condensed in many ways the evidence which I can tell you in many ways summarizes, echoes, I think, everyone would probably agree, I should be told in due course if they don't, the evidence that we have listened to over several weeks from individuals who have spoken here and given us their own voices. So it's presenting very much the same picture with all its nuances arising out of the various different events that lots of different people in their own ways have been through. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take a slightly earlier break for half an hour or so. Let us say, shall we say, 3:20. Can I say to anyone who might be thinking that they are under pressure to get away this evening, that we shall finish this evening no later than 4:30, and it may be that we finish at a convenient moment before then. But I shall see you for the psychosocial experts to start at 3:20.